we are having this conversation ahead of a crucial G20 summit. This is, of course, with anticipation that the African Union is going to get a seat at the table of the G20. We know that there have been a number of endorsements of that coming from capitals like Beijing and Washington and Berlin. So there is significant political will, if you would allow me to say that. And I just want to get a sense from where you sit, Mr. Ojakol. Can we talk a little bit about how you perceive the status quo of representation of African countries when it comes to these global fora? We're talking about the G20 now, but there are a number of others. I'd like to ask you to unmute yourself, please, sir.
Yeah, sorry. So I think that first of all, in the case of the upcoming G20 meeting, I think the theme is one Earth, one family, one future. To my understanding, you can no longer afford to leave the rest of the world behind. The G20 has India, China, the EU, and a few other countries, the US, Japan, and so on, a few other countries. In Africa, we only have South Africa as a member of the G20. Now, that leaves the rest of the 55. So in other words, if South Africa is the only participant from the continent, and there are 55 other countries, that means 54 are not participating in the G20. Now, we have been talking for the last maybe a decade or 2 decades of Africa's integration, both economic as well as political.
Right.
And we have set Agenda 2063 with 14 flagship projects, of which the AfCFTA is only one of them that really speaks to continental economic integration of the continent of Africa. Now, what we hear, the perspective that we know, the moment is that Africa is wishing to speak at various fora with one voice.
Right.
And the upcoming G20 meeting is an opportunity for Africa to speak with one voice. Your question was, how would the representation be in terms of Africa speaking in one voice at the G20?
I want to jump in, Mr. Ojakol. I want to jump in because my question is actually more specifically, it's fair to say that Africa has been underrepresented when it comes to the economic discussion happening at these different forums. What would you say then has been the impact of that, the fact that the continent has been excluded from these forums where, countries sit to discuss the world's problems and how to solve them, and yet we're excluded from that conversation as a collective continent?
Yeah, I think the answer is that because we have not been represented in the various fora where decisions that affect the continent are made, it means that we have been underserved by far. And that is why I think one of the presidents, I think it was President Ruto, he said that if you are not at the table, you will not be able to partake of what is being served at the table. Now we are demanding for a seat at the table so that we get, served and to partake of what is being served at the table. The world is at a very critical stage. I mean, we are talking about climate change, we are talking about security, global security, we are talking climate change, we are talking global economic challenges, we are talking about, and a lot of these decisions and global pandemics that are affecting not just a few parts of the world, but, a broader section of the world. And some of the discussions that are taking place, with a very underrepresented Africa, which is actually playing a significant role in terms of global economy, global security, global, global climate change. The reason why, when we go to if you look at I think it was the Rio Summit in 1992. So the Rio Summit was telling Africa, don't cut your forests. And we're telling them, because they said that our forests are the lungs of the world. Just like the Brazil, the Amazon forest now is the lungs of the world. Right. And we're saying to them that you have cut down your forest. Now you are telling us not to cut down our forests for your well-being, because we are not being represented in the decision-making table. Now, this is the time that we say we need to be fully and significantly represented at the global decision-making forum, because Africa's resources are driving global development. Africa's resources are driving global development. I mean, the mineral wealth from the continent, the forest wealth from the continent, the agricultural production of the continent.
Yes.
Everything that is from the continent is driving global economic growth.
Right.
I just want to give a few examples. We have two countries in the world that are producing 60% of the cocoa. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Please give one example, because I do want to follow up with that. And I have limited time with you today, so I'd like to get through all of my questions.
Absolutely.
So, we're on the point about Africa's resources driving global development. You want to share one example with us?
Absolutely. If you take, we just came out of a G25 summit. There are 25 countries in Africa that produce coffee. So there was a G25 coffee summit to which the Secretariat was invited. Now, there are 25 countries that produce coffee in the world. Now, if you look at how much the African countries are earning from coffee, and we're given the figures, the entire continent earns $2.5 billion from coffee export. But the global coffee industry is $480 billion. By the time you move from the farm to the table, the coffee industry is $480 billion. The ones that are producing it are earning $2.5 billion. Now, even if you add Brazil and Indonesia and Vietnam, the earning is only $25 billion. So if you ask the question, out of $480 billion, these producers are earning $30 billion. So you ask the question, so where is the other $450 billion going? Now, that's one example. The other example is the copper, the cobalt, the coltan. Right.
But I had asked you for that one.
Okay.
So you're at the mercy of my my, what can I call it, kindness today, and I'm not feeling too kind. I think I really love that one example, and I think coffee, for those of us who love a good cup of coffee, I think the next time we're having that sip, we'll think about what you're saying. But I want to bring you back to the point that you made about if you're not sitting at the table, you're not going to get some of what is being served. And I think that really rings true. So I want to ask you then, what do you expect from the Africa seat at the G20 table, where I assume coffee is served? What do we expect from it for our development on the continent? Because on the one hand, we're saying Africa's resources, as you put it, are fueling global development. So when we get the seat at the G20, what's that going to do? What do you expect in terms of economic development on the continent?
Now, I think that's in terms of the expectation. We now have, again, I take you back to the AfCFTA. We now have an agreement that is not just a trade agreement. We usually say the AfCFTA is a development instrument. Why a development instrument? It is encompassing elements of trade, elements of agricultural development and food security. It's encompassing elements of industrialization and value addition at the development of regional value chains. It is talking about SME development. It is talking about inclusive development, a development of the entire. You cannot develop a country or a continent unless you have an inclusive development strategy. So now what we are saying is that through the AfCFTA, through our objective that we have under the Article 3 of the agreement, particularly speaking to industrialization and regional value chain development, we are saying to the African countries that we have to add value to what we are producing in order that we can be able to trade more among ourselves. But also in adding value, we shall be able to trade more between us and the rest of the world. And our terms of trade should improve. Now, at the G20 meeting, what we are going there to say, what we expect is that Africa has developed its priorities. How can the G20 now support Africa to ensure that the priorities that Africa has developed, the framework that Africa has designed, such as the private sector engagement strategy, upon which we are anchoring our industrialization and regional value chain development? How can the G20 be able to, how can we be able to speak to the G20? How can we be able to speak to the private sector in the G20 to bring investment to an Africa that is now open for business,
right?
An Africa that has an agreement for free movement of goods across the continent, an Africa that has now established a protocol on investment that has been adopted by the Assembly that unifies the investment regime across the continent. An Africa where intellectual property will now be protected from country to country using one regime. An Africa where the competition ground has been leveled. So this is the message that we would want the G20 to get, to say that Africa is open for business and we need investment from the G20 in addition to the cross-border investment that is already taking place in Africa among the African countries.
Understood. And Ms. Ojakol, just on that perspective where you say we need to be speaking to the G20, speaking to private sector in the G20, the issue here is you now have the seat at the table, right, when the seat is eventually made available, and it represents a number of countries, 55 countries, and there is the question about a unified voice. And I wondered if you could share with us your perspective on how, a common way can be ensured for the continent, given your experience at the AfCFTA. How do we get that unified voice, bearing in mind this is 55 different countries, different needs, different sectors, etc. Yet we want the same thing, but we have to foster that one voice.
All right, thank you again. The African Union broadly has what is called the policy organs. Now, the policy organs include the Assembly of Heads of State and Government, and they have a chair. And the chairmanship of the Assembly is rotational. I think last year the presidency was in Senegal, which is Western Africa. Correct. Now the presidency of the African Union is in Eastern Africa and the island of the Comoros. The president of the island of the Comoros is the chairperson. Now that is the highest decision level making body of the policy organs of the African Union. Then we have the Executive Council, which is the Ministers of Foreign Affairs. But we also have sectoral councils, they call them the specialized technical committees, which is the other ministers, agriculture, trade, health, infrastructure, and so on. Those are specialized technical committees of ministers. And then there is the Permanent Representative Council that deals with the day-to-day matters in Addis Ababa. So what happens in our decision-making is that views and decisions are gathered from the specialized technical committees. They feed into the Permanent Representative Committee, which is the Committee of Ambassadors in Addis Ababa. That will then go to the Executive Council, which is the Ministers of Foreign Affairs. And from the Executive Council to the Assembly, which will be presided over by the sitting chair. And the rotation is every 1 year. So for this year, it is the president of Morocco, the president of the Comoros is now the chair of the African Union. So when we speak with one voice, there is going to be a coalescing of ideas, a coalescing of decisions that then the chairperson of the African Union or backed by the chairperson of the African Union Commission, because the president of the Comoros is the chairperson of the assembly of the union. But then we have the chairperson of the commission, that is the technical arm, if you like, of the African Union, that supports the chair of the assembly of the heads of state, and also support the PRC, which sits in Addis Ababa. So the coalescing of the ideas and the decisions is what now will be projected by the chairperson of the assembly of the heads of state. However, that does not mean the other heads of state, if invited to the G20, would not be able to say, to supplement on what the chair of the assembly would say. That is usually the procedure, and that's the process that is followed. So in order to get one voice, there has to be regional, national, regional coalition of ideas that will go through that distillation process, as I have said, through the policy organs up to the assembly.
So I guess I'm hearing from you that we will have a unified voice because the structures are there for that. As we sort of bring our conversation to a conclusion, Mr. Ojakol, I think we just want to end off on a note of, if we are to look at the future now, and we look at the moment that we're in, and the reordering of the geopolitical context, if you will, Africa's voice becoming increasingly important, and now, of course, having a seat at this table, given global developments, what can we expect back on the continent from this seat, and what will Africa give to the world? What will we see Africa presenting to the world, given the world order as it is shifting?
If we go with the theme, one Earth, one family, one future, Africa is critical in what is happening in the world currently. You have a migration which is happening across our oceans and our seas from a disadvantaged population in Africa, and that speaks volumes. What is it that this population that is taking risks and crossing oceans is missing in the continent? They are missing a decent source of livelihood. They are missing a decent job. They are missing a decent. So the world should begin to listen to the challenges that Africa is facing. The world should then be able to support the framework that Africa is putting in place in order for us to be able to uplift the economic well-being and the social well-being of the people of the continent. And that's why we are saying that with the framework that we have started under Agenda 2063, the flagship projects, including the AfCFTA, the mineral development, the commodity strategy, the interconnectivity, the infrastructure development that should happen in the continent, and so on. These are the issues that would expect the G20 to begin to address jointly with Africa. We are not saying that we are coming out with a barrel in hand to say this is. We are saying we are coming and saying, can we do a partnership together so that we can begin to look at how we can develop Africa with all the huge resources that we have. The estimate that we have is in the DRC alone, under the ground, is more than $20 trillion of minerals. Just the DRC. Before we add Zambia, before we add Zimbabwe at the Gweru, there is that Gweru area in Zimbabwe that has a lot of minerals. I'm not sure whether you know the Gweru area, but I know that there is minerals from my studies a long time ago. I understand that Gweru is one of those areas. Before you add, Congo, Central African Republic, before you add the Republic of Congo, before you add Angola, before you add. So you have a continent that has huge amount of resources, but a continent that is struggling under a heavy burden, heavy disease burden, heavy poverty, high poverty levels, and so on. So what we are saying is, let us partner to develop the resources of the continent for the benefit of the people of the continent, but also more importantly, for the benefit of the world. like I have said, the resources of the continent are driving the global economy. If Africa cuts off the resources from global supply, economic development will come down. That's for sure. Because what drives industry is the raw material that is coming out of the continent. So we expect that together with the G20, we should be working towards ensuring that we harness the resources of the continent for the development of the continent. But in developing the continent, we will contribute to the development of the global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'll add to your list, Mr. Ojakol, because I think you forgot to mention one thing, and that is, of course, Africa's young people, right? This is the concept.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. Absolutely. I should have mentioned it when I was talking about the people crossing the oceans. Most of them are not old men. Most of them are young people,
right.
Young, able-bodied people. We have below 25%, the population is about 60%. Those who are 25 years and below are 60% of the continent population. And that is and they are very innovative. They are the ones that are tech savvy. They are the ones that are doing, software engineering. They are the ones that are innovating. They are the ones that have boiling ideas that need to be commercialized. They are the ones that are trading across the borders of the continent and taking the risks. Even before we put together the AfCFTA, they were taking the risks. They are still taking the risks because we are still working on some of the frameworks to enable the trading to freely flow across the continent. You're right, Christine, on that one. That's a big dividend. And not just the youth, but the youth and the women. Because these are the people that I've seen across the borders. In all the borders that I have visited in the continent, these are the people that I see crossing the borders with merchants going the other side of the border, bringing another thing from that side of the border to this side of the border, day in and day out, to put food on the table, to get tuition for their siblings or their children, and so on. This is a big dividend that we would like to harness. And that is in the program of the AfCFTA. And that's why we are doing a protocol on women and youth in trade on the AfCFTA, which is actually just awaiting adoption by the Assembly.
Well, I'm looking forward.
Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you. And really to our listening audience, hear it from Mr. Ojakol about the potential that we have on the continent in Africa's women and children, but also the anticipation and the excitement around what will happen at the G20 when Africa finally gets its seat. We'll be looking at a G21. And I wondered if at some point we should be back having a conversation about maybe individual big countries. We know, for example, the European Union is represented, but you've got your Germanys and your Frances, your Italys in the G20. Perhaps then at some point there's room for a Nigeria to have a seat in terms with an African Union seat, and Egypt, Kenya, etc., making that table grow even bigger. Mr. Silver Ojakol, Chief of Staff, to the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Thank you for your insights today and for filling us in on the progress happening at the AfCFTA, as well as, of course, this anticipation of Africa's seat at the G20. We appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christian. Thank you. Have a good day.
Likewise.